Hello and welcome to the Trust and Influence in B2B podcast. I'm your host, Joel Harrison. Now today we're going to talk about the fact that most of the conversations that decide whether you win a B2B deal happen in a room that you will never be in, which is a strange fact that we kind of have to accept in the world we're operating today. Buyers in 2026 increasingly operate in what some call dark mode, exchanging recommendations, comparing notes and shortlisting suppliers in spaces marketers can neither see nor measure. The channels that you can attribute are no longer the channels where decisions are being shaped. And the deals you're losing, many were never in your pipeline to begin with. For senior marketers, that raises a hard question. How do you maximize your impact when the conversations that matter most are the ones you can't see? What does it take to become recommended choice in your market, not just the visible one? To unpack that, I'm joined by Lottie O'Donoghue, who is Strategy Director at Velo, a specialist B2B marketing agency who are built on recommendation. Lottie's career spans client-side leadership at scale-up SaaS businesses, running Accenture's ABM and marketing activity across EMEAR, and now she's shaping strategy for Velo's clients across technology, industrial and professional services. She's a sharp observer of how trust, brand strength and influence actually compound in B2B and what marketers can do to build them deliberately. So in this episode, what are you going to learn? This is a sponsored episode, but there's a very key things we're going to dig into. So first of all, why the recommended choice has moved from a nice to have to a compulsion imperative, the signals that quietly accumulate into recommendation and the ones that marketers most underestimate, how to make the case for investing in influence that doesn't show up in conventional attribution, and where to start if you suspect you're currently not being talked about in the right rooms. So remember, before we dive into the questions, if you find this conversation interesting, well, that's fantastic. We'd love you to subscribe, to like, to rate, to follow. Wherever you get your podcast from, use the appropriate choice. There's loads of great content like this, and following helps me shape the content better and helps me make more success of this podcast and make sure I can produce better, great episodes in the future. So, Lottie, welcome. Great to see you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, we gave you a great introduction there in terms of your background, and you're the archetypal poacher term gamekeeper, and that you've worked client side and now you're working at agencies. Tell us a bit about Velo. Tell a bit more about what you do. You're focusing on this recommendations piece. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, Velo is a specialist B2B marketing agency focusing on those that target a niche within the professional services sectors, manufacturing and technology. And this idea of recommendation marketing, as you say, really came about anecdotally because the agency itself has been built on recommendation, as you said in your intro, and actually we've experienced and observed the power of that recommendation. I think even just looking at it through our own lens and understanding that actually, from an agency perspective, any new business that we win, if we are aware it's come from recommendation, suddenly the odds are completely different. And just having that trust going into the conversation makes such a difference. So it only makes sense that we can apply that to our clients.
It makes sense on so many levels, and forgive me for pronouncing names slightly wrongly. It's Velo.
Okay. Do you know, I always blame Paul, our founder, because he didn't put the E acute on the E acute on the accent. So that is why it's mispronounced so often. So that's not on you.
Okay, well, but anyway, we'll get it right for Velo from here on in. But I think that this notion of recommendations and advocacy in the broader sense is so powerful. Particularly in this world today where AI is so prevalent and is everywhere. You really want trust, and trust comes from people that you believe in and people that you know in your network. They're not trying to sell you something. They've got no axe to grind.
Absolutely, and ironically, even though you just mentioned AI and the fact that in the world of AI, having some recommendation and that element of trust is so key, but actually LLMs are a form of recommendation, right? So there's also that side of it as well. And when we think about how we can influence LLMs as marketers, actually what that looks for is things like authority and trust within our content. So even looking at it through that lens, you think, yeah, it's there.
I hadn't thought of that. That's a very interesting one. Human and non-human recommendation and the differences between them.
Absolutely, yeah. And I was going to say, I think also as marketers, we're in quite a unique position in that we're able to experience how others do their own marketing, in the sense that as a consumer, obviously, you are exposed to marketing. And I think you mentioned advocacy, right, which is a huge one in terms of that trust and recommendation. But I think, anecdotally, I think we've probably all been there where you're looking for something like a restaurant, for example, and you think, right, let's look at the reviews. You get to the restaurant, or at least this is, an experience I've had personally, and you think, something's not quite adding up here. And then when the bill arrives, it's then followed by, do you mind just leaving us a review? And whilst they're lurking over your shoulder, looking at whether you hit the 5-star that they're hoping you to hit, and then it kind of clicks and you think, actually, it's not really true advocacy and that's not someone's true intrinsic opinion. So I think that's often where advocacy and recommendation can almost come amiss, and that's where some of the value is perhaps misaligned.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I did an episode earlier in the year about fake reviews, but these reviews aren't so much fake, they're just kind of unduly influenced. You're kind of contrived, is a good word perhaps, I don't know.
Absolutely.
Okay. There's an awful lot more to unpack here, and I can tell you obviously you've thought about this a lot, and I applaud Velo as an agency for kind of finding an angle and really developing it, because I think that's too many agencies don't have that point of difference. So I think it's a really good thing to hang your hat on, as it were. So let's explore this in more detail, and we've got some good questions to work through. So becoming the recommended choice seems to be moving from a nice to have to a central ambition for B2B marketing leaders. Why do you think that shift is happening now, and what's changed in how buyers actually behave?
I think it's no secret that the buying journey has changed significantly over recent years. For starters, it's more complex than ever. There are more people involved. As I say, that's not new news, but I think with that comes its own challenges in that, as you said at the start, a lot of these conversations happen offline and happen in places that are hard to influence as marketers and as brands, but they're increasingly more and more important. And I think in terms of being the recommended choice, ultimately, if we're thinking about how people win business, whether it's from an RFP or a tender, whatever it might be, procurement often mandate that you have to have at least 3 on your shortlist. And that's very common, but actually thinking about of those that are on that shortlist, who is then selected, actually it's about 90% of people will select their winner from that shortlist. So if you're not on the shortlist in the first place, you're not really in the game. Okay,
so that requires you to do lots of things to get that visibility up front. I mean, no doubt we're going to dig into that further on as we talk today. Was there anything else you wanted to say to follow that up?
I suppose even just thinking about the classic adage of, no one gets fired for choosing IBM, it's all around kind of being risk averse and wanting to make sure that you've got a decision that you can defend later down the line. And as I say, that kind of phrase risk averse, I think is increasingly more important as well, because there are so many things that are going on within macroeconomics that actually there is a lot of uncertainty. So therefore, choosing a brand to go with or making a decision that will have an impact further down the line, it has a lot more considerations as part of it.
But not only on a business level, but there was some great research that came out a few years ago, I mean, which it demonstrates the kind of behavioural economic side of all this, in terms of that people make the choice that is the kind of like the emotional choices, the ones that get made at that second stage, beyond shortlisting. It's the ones that aren't going to get you sacked, aren't going to make you look like an idiot in front of your clients, and often they kind of post-rationalise why they've made choices. It's a fascinating kind of matrix of decisions that go into that final decision making.
Absolutely, and as you say, the idea of post-purchase dissonance and the fact that actually people are so worried about getting it wrong that they have to make sure that it is absolutely the right choice, and that comes with a lot of different things and a lot of headaches, actually, I think, for marketers and brands.
Post-purchase dissonance is going to be my expression of the day, though. So I really like that one. That's great. So as we've spoken about, there's good evidence that buyers rarely look beyond the 3 shortlisted options. What does that change? What does that reality change about how marketers should be spending their time and their budget?
I think that's a very good question, because but if I had the answer to it, then I think I could probably retire quite soon. It's a really hard one, because actually I think it goes beyond marketing. I think marketers have a really important role in making sure that they are almost creating the environment to actually enable it. And I think a word you used earlier was kind of compounding factors, which I think is really true of this, because realistically, to be recommended, everything has to line up from a brand perspective, right? So it's not just the product that you're delivering, but it's also actually, once that product or service is delivered, what's the post-delivery service like, so to speak? So thinking about the customer success side of things, And there are so many factors across the business that have to pull together in order for it to work realistically, because recommendation also comes from different places. And going back to what we said earlier about buying units being more complex, actually it's not just one person that we're speaking to. So just because one person's had a really great experience with your brand, if other people haven't, they could become a blocker down the line, right?
So it's a complex thing to put together, but the value speaks in terms of the prize, which is that kind of customer growth and that, new customer expansion.
Absolutely. And I think just in terms of where marketers can be spending their time and their focus, I know brand activity often gets pushed down the chain in terms of priority, which I can understand in terms of pressure from CFOs, for example. And obviously it's harder from an attribution perspective, right, to be able to justify why that is so valuable. But again, as part of this recommendation marketing idea, it just proves why it is so important and so key, because if people haven't heard of you, then they won't know to even consider you as part of the shortlist, right? So
Yeah.
I would always encourage marketers to be thinking about the brand side of things, but not just from an awareness perspective. It's almost thinking about, right, who are we as a brand and how can we actually communicate what people need and want to hear from us to make that decision.
Okay. So let's dig into this a bit further. Let's talk about the kind of mini signals that perhaps compound into that recommendation. So trust often gets described as sitting beneath a set of smaller signals, things like salience, credibility, visibility, reputation. How do these signals actually accumulate into a recommendation, and which do marketers tend to underestimate?
So the underestimation question is interesting. I'll come back to that. But in terms of those mini signals, I think there are so many, but a bit of a cop-out in terms of response. It depends who you are as an individual and actually what you value. Because I think proof of performance, for example, is a great signal, and it pertains to trust as well, but ultimately it helps you to become recommended, right? But like we said earlier with that kind of anecdote of if you go into a restaurant and you look at a review that's perhaps manufactured, again, if you see a testimonial or a case study that a brand has shared themselves, ultimately, there's an ulterior motive there, right? Whereas if we look at something like UCG content or UGC content, that I think is increasingly more and more important, because it's almost a form of free social listening realistically, but actually as a brand, that's a really valuable area for people to explore and actually hear what people are saying about you. And hopefully some of it will be positive, and that's great, and you can use that as part of your marketing and your efforts. But actually some of the kind of quote unquote negative commentary is equally as useful, because it's then something that you can take forward and have conversations with people, but also from a business perspective start unpicking actually why or where has it gone wrong. So I think that's one of those trust signals that I always kind of hone in on.
I guess the shorthand for that could be the adage that the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. So you have to leverage the good and the bad and the ugly, and to make your offering better, essentially.
Absolutely. But I think what's interesting there as well is that, again, as marketers, it's almost a bit of an area or an arena that we can't really go into, because as soon as you enter as a brand, suddenly actually everyone's kind of, it almost feels like their space has been invaded, so to speak, and what was more of an organic and an intrinsic conversation actually suddenly almost, it makes them feel like they're being watched. So again, it almost dilutes what the impact of that could be. But I think that as a trust and a proof signal is really important. But then we mentioned earlier as well, LLMs, again, increasingly, that is such an influence, obviously, from an AI perspective. And that almost does the other end of that spectrum, because we've just spoken about the human side of things there, but then we've still got the AI and machine side of things on the other end of the spectrum as well.
There's lots of nuance in this, isn't there?
A lot, yeah.
Okay. Well, it's a fascinating conversation. Okay, so let's dig in a bit further. So let's talk about known versus recommended, right? Because there's a real difference between being known and being recommended. Where do brands, or how do brands often confuse the two, and what does that cost them?
Yeah, again, an interesting one, because you'd think as a marketer, being known is an objective, right? You want people to know and recognize your brand. But again, to unpack that a little bit more, it's making sure you're known for the right things as well, because of course, you know, the goal is, yeah, you become known and your brand is the one that is then recommended and you end up on the shortlist, etc. But actually sometimes, and what I've experienced with brands a lot in the past, is that if things like positioning and services aren't clear, being known is great, but actually you might not quite be known for the right thing. In fact, I actually had an example with a client recently where I was looking at some of their RFPs just to do some analysis, and I'd spotted that they were named as a recommendation to approach within the RFP, which you think, great, that's, you know, the ultimate goal, right? But actually they didn't offer the service that this RFP was for. So there was a little bit of a mismatch there, because whilst it was in the right arena or the right space, when you drilled down further, that subsector didn't quite align. So that was really interesting. And then the second piece within that same RFP was that actually the brand name wasn't quite expressed properly. So again, it's kind of, you're almost there, but not quite at the same time. So then from a marketer's perspective, that's a signal to say, right, okay, actually, we're clearly being spoken about in the right places, but we've got a little bit of work to do to make sure that we are expressing ourselves really clearly and, you know, in a way that is accessible for our clients to be able to understand what we do realistically.
Yeah, that's a frustrating one, isn't it? If you're being put forward for something which you can't actually offer, you know,
Yes.
there's some cross wires somewhere in that, and that needs to be unpicked. Again, you will never spot that unless you're trying to dig into those signals. So,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
so let's talk a bit about where the influence actually comes from. You know, and recommendation implies someone else is doing the advocating on your behalf. How much of that is genuinely within marketers' control versus earned indirectly over time?
I think sadly the reality is that we wish it would be more within our control. I mean, we've just spoken about the fact that user-generated content is a really big influence in terms of recommendation, but as marketers it's a bit of a paradox because we can't really control or influence that. But the way that we can help to influence it is actually by doing things that, you know, we realistically should be doing as part of those core pillars. So generating content that is truly authoritative and has a unique point of view and is something that our audience actually wants to consume as well. And again, if we think about it from the other side of things, as in from LLMs, as we say, that is something that they very much are looking for as a signal to actually then recommend you, so to speak, as a brand or as a reference in part of AI search. But then in
Okay.
terms of other ways that we can help to influence things, again, it's not all on marketers' shoulders, it's kind of the wider business functions as well. So even being able to work more closely with the sales team or the customer success team to make sure that what they have from a sales enablement perspective is really working for them. And it's something
Yeah.
that helps to enable them to almost kind of continue on before and after where marketers play their role, so that it
Yeah.
doesn't feel like a handoff.
So much of that value is actually in that kind of delivery of the product and management of the account, isn't it? You know, and
Absolutely.
so it's very, very powerful. So, getting onto the shortlist, the tender framework, the RFP list, that's increasingly a prerequisite for winning. What separates the brands that consistently make it onto that list and those that don't?
I suppose it comes down to consistency, in a word, because again, making sure that as a brand you have a really clear position in terms of who you are and what you do, and then being able to communicate that out. Because as you said at the beginning, all of these signals compound, so it's not something that you can necessarily change overnight, sadly. So it is something that has to be a consistent effort that is built up. And then in terms of separating those that consistently make the shortlist, a way that I have found effective in terms of trying to identify some of those kind of patterns, if you like, is actually being able to speak to customers that you have had success with to understand actually what was it that tipped that over the line for us as a brand. And then equally, if you're lucky enough to actually be able to speak to those where you didn't have success. And granted, that's much harder from an access perspective. Not everyone might want to or might have the luxury of being able to give you their time, but if you're able to and you can have those conversations, I think that's one of the most powerful routes that you can go down.
Yeah, that seems like there's a tremendous value in that, I'm sure. One protagonist within the whole the marketing world, I suppose you could call it, is the who often gets labelled as the bad guy in all of this is the CFO, and trust is often dismissed as something that's soft or hard to measure. How do you make the case to a skeptical CFO that investing in recommendation and reputation delivers a commercial return?
Yes, I think everyone's favourite CFO often gets a bit of a hard rap, don't they? But I mean, it's like we were saying earlier with brand as well. It increasingly gets challenged because it is really hard to measure. But candidly, attribution in general is increasingly hard to measure. I think that's every CMO's kind of nightmare or headache at the moment, isn't it, realistically? And as you said at the beginning, this idea of dark channels where conversations are happening where as marketers we just can't track them all the time. So to try and communicate that to the CFO and get approval, yeah, it's a real challenge. But ultimately, as we say, we know that, you know, up to 70% of conversations or decisions actually happen before that shortlist has even been put together. So, you know, as we say, if you're not on that shortlist, you quite literally won't be in the running at all. So whilst it's not necessarily a kind of concrete or a clear metric, that is the conversation that we need to be having.
Yeah,
And equally,
absolutely.
being able to do that analysis on any win versus losses as well, and being able to use those stats to have the conversation with your CFO is something that we would really advise.
Yeah, the kind of it's annoying, isn't it? But the negatives, in some ways, is the best way of illustrating that. You want to be about positives, but some perhaps negatives is playing to the dark side is a shame. But I guess some needs must, I suppose.
Absolutely. And yeah, as you say, you obviously want to kind of be going in with a positive, you know, outlook on things, but ultimately sometimes it's almost, you know, what is the cost if we don't do this, rather than actually what's the gain if we do this.
Yeah. Okay. So, where should we? Let's think about practical steps then. For a marketing leader who knows they're not currently the recommended choice in their market, or they're not often enough the recommended choice, where should they start? What steps could they take, and what's the best mistakes that they should try and avoid making early on in that process?
I think ultimately it's really starting with your customer, right? And we, as marketers, would like to think we know our customers, and it's, you know, it's great if we've got top line personas which still serve a purpose, absolutely, but we know that people are nuanced, and I think ABM has been great for this in the sense that where we now have so much, I mean, in some ways it's a bit scary, but we have so much information on individuals, and we can actually really understand how individuals, as in the decision maker, as a person, would likely find their influence, or how they would actually make a decision, right? So it's really starting with the customer and doing what I would call kind of, in inverted commas, true voice of the customer work. So rather than just either taking what we think to be our customer's perspective, actually really understanding it. And we spoke earlier about if we're able to have conversations directly with either existing customers or with those that almost came close but didn't quite convert, that's a really great place to start and have those really honest conversations rather than just building a foundation based on assumption.
Okay, that sounds like a sensible place to start, and you're really kind of getting under the skin of the problem rather than trying to assume there's a surface level quick fix, because these things aren't simplistic, right? So the detail required.
Yeah, and I think that word honesty is really key in the sense that, you know, as a business, you may have a product, for example, that is not quite where it needs to be, but don't worry, we've got a roadmap and it's coming, which often is enough for the sales team to go, great, we have got this on the horizon, but actually the horizon might be a little bit closer in their minds and when they're selling than it is in reality, right? But from a customer perspective, if you're buying something that you think, yeah, this is going to solve my problems, but actually the reality is it might not solve your problems quite immediately and you've got a bit of a delay. Again, if we think back to that post-purchase dissonance and the fact that actually as a consumer, our experience with a brand and a product will sit with us. And to your point, particularly if it's a negative opinion or a negative experience, sadly, and it's really hard to change that perspective afterwards. So I think that's a really key thing, to be really honest and pragmatic about what you are able to offer as a brand with your products and services as well, so that you're not almost kind of amplifying something that actually isn't quite true.
Yeah, quite exactly. So we touched earlier on, it's a marketing podcast, so we're duty bound to talk about AI at least 3 times in this conversation.
Yes,
And AI, as we know that AI is reshaping discovery recommendation. Looking ahead, how do you see the recommendation marketing evolving as buyer behaviour and AI driven discovery shifts? What should we be preparing for right now? Because I suspect what we're seeing now is kind of like this is the bleeding edge, the tip of the iceberg. But this is the start of a journey, right?
absolutely. I think you just hit the AI quota in that question as well. So tick. Again, if we think about ourselves as consumers and how we use AI to look for things like shortlists, or if we are just doing our own discovery, B2B buyers are doing the same thing. So kind of the AI generated shortlist, it's only going to be more and more prevalent, right? So as we say, thinking about how we can influence LLMs and making sure that our brands or our products or services are surfacing within those AI generated results is really key, because often actually people aren't going to click through to websites because actually those habits have already started to change, as you say, and it's only going one way.
Yeah, it's a fascinating transformational moment, isn't it? So, but you guys focusing on at Velo, you're trying to build out this thinking around recommendations. You built the 6 R's framework. Walk us through that. Tell us about that. What led you to do that, and tell us how it works.
Yes, I mean, clearly what marketers need is another framework that has got an illustration. But the 6 R's of recommendation marketing was something that we pulled together just as a way of explaining the process, if you like. And earlier on you asked me kind of where I would start with clients. And I think this is a really helpful place, because the first R is reveal. So it's looking at uncovering where the influence actually happens. Because again, when we think about those complex buying units and how the buying decisions are changing, we really need to understand what is happening, because the channels that used to work no longer always work, and actually, as we say, different individuals will have a different approach. So that first R is reveal, to make sure that we can actually figure out where on earth we're starting from.
Okay. And we're going to put a link to it so you can see the other phases in it. But I guess what happens over time is you're building up and you're building layers of analysis, layers of insight. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's almost kind of going through a bit of a flywheel, if you like, and that's deliberate in the sense that you kind of go through the steps, but actually the final one is review, so that you're constantly kind of evolving and iterating it. Because, as I say, things are changing so quickly these days, obviously exacerbated by AI and the way that is influencing how we as marketers and consumers are changing in our behaviours. But it just means that actually the 6 R's is a framework that as marketers we can be looking at it to actually break down what we need to be doing. And it's almost a bit of a mini guide or a checklist to help us get to where we need to be.
Lottie, we talked about how you need to focus on listening and understanding the customer voice first of all, and we've talked about the fact you have this 6 R's framework, which really provides a more holistic, strategic view of this. But if people have been listening to this conversation, watching this conversation, it's resonated with them, and they want to go and start thinking about acting on it straight away, what's the one thing they can do tomorrow to kind of start them on this journey? One thing they can think about to get them going in the right direction?
I think probably having an honest reflection on how well your kind of commercial strategy is communicated from a marketing perspective, and realistically understanding what the reality of your kind of win to loss ratio is, so to speak, in the sense that actually in the scenarios where we've been recommended and we're on that shortlist, actually of those, where have we won?
Okay, that sounds good. That's a very sensible place to leave it. So really good advice, and it's such a fascinating topic right now, and it's going to become only more important, not only in the AI realm as we've spoken about, but also in the wider in the human realm, right, which we all inhabit. And I think there's a general trend towards humanization is only going to grow. So Lottie, thank you so much for being my guest today. I really enjoyed talking to you about this.
No, thank you for having me. It was great to chat.
Well, if you've enjoyed this conversation, please remember we'd love you to like or subscribe or to follow, whichever you get this podcast, and please leave us a rating if you can. It's really helpful to us to get more traction around the podcast, so I can continue getting great guests for the podcast and having insightful marketing conversations. So that's it for today. Thanks for listening. I hope you can join us again very, very soon. Goodbye.